Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. There's only really one place to start this week, and that's with the slightly delayed first official meeting between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett that was supposed to take place on last Thursday and was delayed to Friday because of the suicide attack which took place just outside Kabul airport, which ended up killing, I think, almost 200 people, including 13 US servicemen. Obviously, with that going on, the meeting had to be delayed. It's very unfortunate. First of all, it was very unfortunate because of the suicide attack, but sort of more parochial outlook. It was certainly unfortunate for Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett went there as a prime minister, really needing a photo op, really not necessarily for his legitimacy, because now, he's the accepted prime minister. There's no one who doesn't accept it, except for a few extreme, perhaps, Likudnikim. But he certainly needed it to put him on the world stage. A prime minister who is able to sit in the White House opposite a sitting president. It goes a long way in Israel. It's the kind of photo op which Prime Minister Netanyahu in the past used, and many others before him. It is obviously with, in Israel, US is certainly the foremost, the strongest ally, and so a picture, sitting across from the president, the American president, is very important. And in fact, it was originally scheduled for prime time TV in Israel. I believe it was supposed to be 8 o'clock, was supposed to be the prepared statements, 8 o'clock Israel, which is prime time. It would have led the news. We would have got all the pictures, all the niceties, all the smiles when the meeting took place. Obviously, because of what happened in Kabul, it was less a smiley event, let's say. It was less a happy event. And in the end, it took place really just before the Shabbat here in Israel on the Friday. The newspapers had already been put to bed Thursday night. Bennett was certainly hoping to have that picture plastered on every front cover of every newspaper in Israel. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, so I had to wait till Sunday for that. And there was a lot of momentum. Obviously, there's nothing anyone could do about it, but it certainly was one thing that that Prime Minister Bennett would have liked to have ticked off on his meeting with President Biden. But what did happen in the meeting? First of all, it does seem like the meeting was positive. The meeting was good. The meeting went as well as anyone can expect on a number of issues. There was, a certain amount of understanding, let's say, if not agreement. There's obviously disagreement on the Palestinian issue, which we're going to start. Prime Minister Bennett was very vocal in saying before the meeting, let alone probably during the meeting, that he has to appease both sides of his coalition. As we know, it's left, right, center, even an Arab party. And as far as the Palestinian issue goes, he put out two promises which pretty much he won't be breaking, pretty much ones that it's clear he's going to keep. The first one is there'll be no annexation of territory over the Green Line in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, which is clear because Prime Minister Netanyahu had long talked about annexation, had taken it off the table during the Abraham Accords. That was one of the quid pro quo that the Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, and others placed on those deals. And it's something that obviously then President Donald Trump was happy to go along with, and in the end, Prime Minister Netanyahu went along with. And don't forget, this is a Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who's talked about annexation as part of his party platform for at least a number of elections. But again, it's not really, so out of the box. No one really believes with the government that he has, or pretty much any government, that there's going to be, those those of you who are regulars to Israel Insider will remember even at the height of all the talk of annexation, I was very skeptical that there would be any, or very minimal amounts, and in the end there was none. So that was one promise. The other is that there'll be no Palestinian state on his watch. I mean, that's something the Americans can understand. They won't necessarily agree to it, not agree to the principle, but they would certainly like to see some sort of a political process, but they understand A, the structure of the government, and B, they understand that the Palestinian leadership is weak. It has very little interest in a real process. At the moment, Mahmoud Abbas is in Cairo meeting with President Sisi and King Abdullah of Jordan. The idea there is to try and get some sort of momentum. This is what's being pushed out to the media, some sort of momentum back into a peace process there. They're trying to push the quartet to take over. If we remember, the quartet resurrect, I believe it was the early 2000s, where it was the quartet is the US, Russia, EU, and UN. There was a roadmap put up by the quartet and some other initiatives, but it never came to anything. As far as Israel is concerned, that's a non-starter. Israel really will only rely on the US to be an honest partner. And this is probably more than anything else, just an attempt by the Palestinian leadership to try and get other players involved and to try and take back the momentum a little bit. But under Naftali Bennett, it's unlikely that there'll be any sort of political process. In fact, Benny Gantz, who we'll talk about in a minute, was on the media today. And don't forget, Benny Gantz represents at least a center-left opinion within the government. And he said that there won't be any political process. He doesn't foresee any. So those two promises that Bennett kept are not going to be any great surprise for the Israeli publics and nor the American administration. What was important is there's no disagreement on that. It was not raised publicly. It was raised behind closed doors, the Palestinian issue. What seems to be clear is that President Biden did ask the Israeli Prime Minister to take certain steps, both vis-a-vis Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah and in Gaza vis-a-vis the people there. What we've seen in the days since is quite a few steps that have been taken. Benny Gantz, who I referred to before, defense minister, who's in charge really of relations to a certain extent with Ramallah, certainly on the security and even the economic level, has agreed to a loan, has agreed to various other steps, and even a fairly, not unprecedented, but certainly for at least 10 years, if not longer, for a defense minister to travel to Ramallah and to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, which happened the other day. There was a bit of a disagreement exactly who was behind it, whether it was coordinated with the Prime Minister. It's clear it was coordinated. Defense Minister Gantz wouldn't have been able to do it without at least alerting the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister would have had to give, if not necessarily his full-throated support, at least his blessing. But it's clear that Naftali Bennett got quite a bit of pushback from the right wing of his coalition, not so much from within his party, but more from Gideon Saar's New Hope party, which didn't like the meeting, or at least had to voice its opinion publicly that it didn't like it. As I said, there's a lot of politics involved, and sometimes you have to make noise, knowing that you can't really take action, because in a razor-thin majority that this government has, that they can't really, if you're going to threaten to vote against this or not to support the government, that could mean the end of the government, especially with the budget coming up literally in days. But what Naftali Bennett certainly wasn't happy about is that this got a lot of attention and it made him look a little bit weak. But it's clear that there was at least a very high level of coordination. Other than that, some very conciliatory steps being taken in Gaza, a lot of what's called goodwill or humanitarian measures, the fishing, the amount of waters that can be fished by Gazan fishermen was extended to the largest amount for many, many years, 15 kilometers or 50 miles. Usually the maximum was 13. Lots of trucks have entered Kerem Shalom with humanitarian, with construction materials, and also a lot more Gazan workers were allowed into Israel. A lot more permits were given for them to work in Israel, and various other humanitarian steps. What is infuriating, at least the right wing at this point, is that these steps were being taken as the heat was raised within Gaza. What we've seen for the last at least 4 or 5 nights, and we're seeing again tonight, is activities within Gaza. Hamas are not openly involved, but clearly they are strongly supportive and behind the scenes, because nothing like this happens in Gaza without their say-so, is hundreds of Gazans armed approach different areas of the fence, the border between Gaza and Israel, and burn tires and throw projectiles. We saw an Israeli soldier who was shot point blank by an armed Palestinian the other day, and unfortunately that soldier has now succumbed to his wounds and has died. And there's a lot of anger about that. A lot of Israelis who are demonstrating believe that the soldiers on that border have not been given strong enough orders to respond to fire. They believe that the army is restraining them, is not allowing them to shoot on protesters, even when they have cause to believe that there's some danger to their lives. Benny Gantz, again, on his interview on Prime Time today, said, of course, that's not true. The IDF does have rules of engagement that allow a soldier to open fire on anyone that they believe poses a danger to them. But there is significant anger over that, and it's certainly going to grow in the days to come, especially as it seems that this government is making more and more goodwill gestures towards the Gaza Strip as things are heating up. Now, Benny Gantz's argument again on TV is that he can always reverse them. Nothing there is written in stone. And if there were trucks coming in yesterday, it doesn't mean there will be tomorrow. But at the moment, the equation seems to be that Israel is trying to take steps to calm the situation. Going back to the meeting with Biden, my assessment would be that these were things that were asked and were pretty much given by Israel. What's happening in the government is that Benny Gantz, as I said, who represents to a certain extent the left of center part of the government, it has a lot more wiggle room, and Prime Minister Bennett, it's much easier for him politically to allow him to be seen as leading on these things, whereas Bennett, is at arm's length. But on the Iran issue, the Biden-Bennett meeting, that was obviously a big focus for Israel, at least. And what was most interesting is that President Biden put all options back on the table. We certainly haven't heard that from President Biden since he came into office, and it certainly rattled the Iranians. The Iranian, I believe, foreign minister or foreign ministry actually put out a tweet in Hebrew saying that this was like an attack on Iran, the fact that they put the military option back on the table. But that's certainly something that Prime Minister Bennett would be happy to hear. And at the end of the day, it was a pretty convivial meeting. It was a good meeting, a good atmosphere. There were no disagreements, certainly not publicly, and really not that much behind the scene. Another thing which he wanted to come home with, Naftali Bennett, and certainly it seems that there's movement on it, is visa waivers for Israelis. At the moment, Israeli citizens who want to visit America have to apply for a visa, and many of those are turned down. But there are many other countries that, like the EU, like the UK and others, can just go into America without having to apply for a visa in advance. So if he could manage to get that concession out of the US in the future, that would be also a major feather in his cap. But on Iran, it does seem that there is an understanding that for the moment, diplomacy is not working. The Iranians said as much. They said that we're going to have to put off any future talks for a few months, which is worrying from Israel's point of view, especially when you have Defense Minister Benny Gantz saying that the Iranians are weeks away from nuclear weapons capability, months perhaps. And so this is probably a delaying tactic. So the fact that the Americans were talking strong, President Biden was talking strong on the Iran issue, will certainly be a relief to Israeli ears. And basically that was really the meeting was about getting to know you, a photo op, sort of making nice, trying to change the atmosphere between the two parties. Obviously, both of them are relatively new in their position. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu certainly had annoyed the Democratic Party over the previous years. We don't need to go into the history there. President Donald Trump, obviously President Biden wanted to try and change some of the things that President Trump had done. But as far as Israel so far, there haven't been too many steps. There's talk about reopening the American consulate in East Jerusalem, but there's an understanding that that could be a problem for Bennett's coalition. And it does seem that the Americans understand the sensitivity of this coalition. So to put up too many things which are going to cause sparks between the parties is going to be put off until after the budget. As I've said many times in recent weeks, the budget is the most important thing on the Israeli political agenda, and the Americans understand that once that's passed, there's a certain amount of comfort. Things will change for the better, I would say, for the coalition, and for the worse for the opposition, and the Americans understand that. On Thursday, we're going to have the first vote on the new budget and the arrangements laws, which I spoke about, which goes along with it. There's still tension on that issue. The arrangement laws, especially on the agricultural reform, is something which some of the members of Knesset on the left are not happy about, and they said they'll vote against. Don't forget, I said this before, it's a razor-thin majority, 51, maybe 52. And we have the leader of the Labour Party, who's in America, who doesn't seem to who will not, it seems, be able to get back to Israel on time because she's just gone to visit her newborn son, which was from a surrogate mother, and it doesn't seem that she'll be back. So that could also create a lot of problems for the coalition. And as I've said before, the coalition really has to speed up the process for the budget if it's going to reach that November timeline, because we have the Jewish holidays next week that will basically set off almost a month of Jewish holidays where there's only about 8 or 9 working days, and then we're already into October, and these things take time, especially with a vigorous opposition which is going to filibuster and really push the government at every turn. So what we're going to see as of Thursday is really, as I said, the scrap, the fight between the coalition and the opposition, and the coalition have to be extremely in line, have to be unified, have to turn up to every vote, and they can't afford to have any abstentions in the coalition. This is now where all attention in Israel on the political front is going to be turned, and also, as I said, to a certain extent, in the international front. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. From Kahari, did Biden ask the Israeli Prime Minister about the Israeli-Chinese rapprochement?
From what my understanding is, it didn't come up significantly. I don't know if it was raised at all, but it didn't seem to be a significant issue. And as I've said before, when it comes to choosing between China and the US, there's no debate amongst any Israeli leader from left or right.
All right, thank you so much. David Levine asks, in light of the way the US pulled out of Kabul, can you summarize the reaction of Israelis vis-a-vis their own confidence in America as a reliable ally?
That's a good question. No one's talking about it openly, although Yair Lapid, in a briefing to foreign reporters, said that it was the right move done wrongly. And certainly maybe the timing wasn't correct. He corrected himself and said we should listen to what President Biden said. It was a very difficult decision and there's no way to do it or whatever. Which may not be met so kindly in America, especially with this no criticism understanding between the two nations. In Israel, there's certainly a worry that it could embolden Islamist groups around the world. We saw this relationship, this burgeoning relationship between Hamas and Taliban. It actually has gone back a while, and there was a meeting a few months ago, and Hamas put out a congratulatory note to Taliban and basically said, we hope to see the same thing here. And Taliban responded in kind, saying, this is the beginning of the end to any occupations, and we support Palestine from the river to the sea. So it certainly does seem like it's going to embolden groups, Islamist groups around the world. And it's certainly, worrying when, someone said that the difference in firepower between the US and the Taliban is far greater than between Israel and Hamas, and certainly Israel and Hezbollah. So some have suggested that, Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups, that even though they are inferior in firepower to Israel, maybe they have the tenacity, the long-term vision, the steadfastness to sit around and wait their opponents out. Obviously, it's very different because at the end of the day, Afghanistan is very far from the homeland, from the US homeland, and no one was fighting for their homes there. Here, it's obviously very, very different. But there is a feeling amongst certain experts, including in Israel, that Islamist groups are emboldened by this, and that's certainly not good for Israel, the West, allies, or the US itself.
And a quick follow-up on this, we had an entire webinar devoted to this. A viewer asks, is the Taliban a threat to Israel, and are they an ally or an enemy of Iran?
They're certainly not an ally, although apparently I just saw pictures, I can't verify if they're true, that the Taliban is starting to sell some of the equipment left behind by the US to Iran, and there have been pictures of some of this equipment in Iran itself. Don't forget there's the Shiite element and the Sunni element. They're certainly not close and warm relations, but they do have a common enemy. But the Taliban really at this point is most focused on rule, governance and rule. They have a country which is in ruins. They have a bit of a brain drain. A lot of gifted people have left the country, have fled either over land or with these air convoys. And they were desperate for a lot of the bureaucrats to stay, and many of them would have gone with the Western forces. And at that moment, they're really trying to focus on governance rule. They do have a fight with the Islamic State. They are certainly enemies. As we saw the other, the suicide bomb outside the Kabul airport was perpetrated, or at least they took responsibility, Islamic State, and it killed quite a few Taliban fighters as well. There is a worry that Al-Qaeda, who some have said throughout these 20 years of American presence in Afghanistan, they kind of just settled amongst the people, many of them intermarried amongst Afghanis. These are Al-Qaeda foreign fighters. So there is a perhaps low-level foundation for them to return, and that would certainly be a worry, not just for Israel, but for the West. The Taliban themselves do not represent, really a strategic threat to Israel or any sort of threat, but Afghanistan could once again become a base for global jihadi terrorist organizations. And certainly that's a worry for Israel, the US, and the West, as I said before.
Thank you. And now on to the meeting with Gantz and Abbas, where Len asked, and a few others actually asked on this, was there any concessions made by Abbas in exchange for the loan, such as the end of pay to slay or incitement?
No, it doesn't seem that there were. It was more, according to Defense Minister Gantz, it was more talk about security, cooperation. It served both of their interests. Abbas certainly, it helps him because he's a bit sidelined. He hasn't met with any significant Israeli leader for a long time. Benny Gantz shores up, as the, if we dig down a little bit into Israeli politics, Benny Gantz has to try and find an audience for the future. Yesh Atid is the largest group in the coalition, which is very hard to differentiate between blue and white and Yesh Atid. So maybe this is blue and white, led by Benny Gantz's way to try and differentiate themselves. They're more interested in a political process because Yesh Atid and Yair Lapid is pretty much fallen in very nicely with Bennett, that there is no political process at this time, even though he's not against the two-state solution as opposed to Bennett. Lapid certainly hasn't been touting it. So maybe this is Benny Gantz's opportunity. And don't forget, as Benny Gantz himself was questioned tonight, he still has an offer by the Likud to leave this government and then become prime minister in a right-wing government. He didn't deny that the offer took place today during his interview, and he didn't even say he would never take it. He said, I'm only interested in this government, I'm supportive of this government, I think Prime Minister Bennett is doing a good option, but he was very careful not to. And that's whether he's serious or not about taking it, and I'm sure he will remember how he was treated by former Prime Minister Netanyahu, by completely denying it and saying that it's completely off the table, certainly would lose him a certain amount of leverage. So all of these things play very much into what we saw this week. Concessions by the Palestinians, nothing was really released. It doesn't seem that there were any, but it certainly seems to me that much of this was asked by the Americans to make these concessions towards the Palestinians.
Understood. Thank you. From Jeffrey Sheff, in the original Gaza withdrawal agreement, it included the creation of a safe corridor along the border in Gaza territory. To prevent further conflict at the border, it has been suggested for Israel to finally create that corridor. How likely is this?
Well, in the end, that was in one of the first drafts of the disengagements, to have some sort of originally Israeli presence. Prime Minister Sharon back in the day wanted to have a permanent Israeli presence there. That was nixed by the Americans under George W. Bush, who wanted a complete withdrawal to every last inch. Then there was this idea, UBAM, which was a European monitoring to try and monitor smuggling going across that Egypt-Gaza border. And at the first sign of trouble, we saw the UBAM forces run away. Actually, I think they ran away 3 times. They ran away, came back, ran away, came back. So that pretty much the border, at least on the Gaza side is held by Hamas. On the Egyptian side, we've certainly seen mostly some good work by the Egyptians who have tried to stop the smuggling. But obviously some of it still does get through every now and again. But on the whole, that's not where it certainly isn't the smuggling that we saw back in the day. But as far as I'm aware, there is no intention by Israel to put back that sort of security barrier, because that's not really where, let's say, the action, quote unquote, is happening today, and that seems to be happening all along the border. These Gazan militants who are creating these nightly disturbances are basically all along the border, sometimes the north, sometimes the southern part, sometimes, so there's no one part of the border that's sort of safer or more stable than any of the others at this point.
Thank you. And you spoke about the budget, and there's been some issues with that in the past. Do you think it's likely to pass this time, or is there still hesitancy?
There's certainly disagreements, and so far, according to some in Labour Merits, they've said that they're not going to pass the arrangements law, which is a sort of addendum, but sometimes even more important than the budget itself, because there is one of the most problematic parts for them is the reform of the agricultural sector, which we spoke about in the past. The agricultural sector has a very strong lobby, especially with the left-wing parties, with the history of the kibbutzim, the agricultural sector being part of the workers' unions, et cetera, et cetera. So they have a very strong voice in those parties, and they've been lobbying very hard. And at the moment, there's at least a handful of members of Knesset who said that they'll vote against the arrangements bill in its current form. There have been, really round-the-clock meetings, the finance ministry with some of these MKs. Prime Minister Bennett has got involved. Finance Minister Victor Lieberman's got involved. I think at the end it will pass. There'll be compromises on all sides, and all sides will be able to walk away and say we got what we wanted. Because I think it's just too early for this government to fall. I think no one wants to go to elections, and if the budget isn't passed, that's what automatically happens. And I don't see, certainly none of the leaders want it. Whether they can keep every single member of Knesset in check, that remains to be seen. But I would say that the likelihood is that the budget will pass, because it's just far too early, and everyone has an interest in gaining some achievements from the budget and not going to elections so soon. And don't forget, if elections do come, everyone still understands the person sitting on the other side of the aisle, Benjamin Netanyahu, still the leader of the Likud, still polling very, very well, still only 1 or 2 seats away from having a majority for a right-wing government. So I don't see too many parties really gambling on such an eventuality. There's a lot of muscle flexing, saber rattling, but I think at the end it will pass.
Thank you. And in our last minute here, Len Levin asks, what's the latest on the coronavirus situation in Israel as to the high holidays and in general?
Well, the schools went back today. It was the first day of school. There was a big debate, won't they start the school year? But it seems that this government, as opposed to the last one, is very strongly against lockdowns or high restrictions. There have been a certain amount of restrictions, but they haven't gone too far, even though the daily amount of cases, positive cases, is pretty high. It's over 10,000 for a couple of days. And actually, I saw a statistic today or yesterday that it was the highest per million anywhere in the world. But what we have seen, even though there is a high number of people getting it every day, the number of seriously ill has actually plateaued or even gone down. That's probably largely to do with the rollout of the third vaccine, which seems to just give you a lot more antibodies. So whereas it doesn't necessarily stop you from getting the coronavirus, it certainly seems to prevent a lot of the more serious cases. And now we're seeing a vast majority of people who are seriously ill, who are dying, are the unvaccinated, even though they represent less than 10% of the age groups that are getting ill and dying. So it's clear that the third vaccine rollout is working, is having an effect, because at the end of the day, you want to stop people dying, you want to stop people getting seriously ill, even if the numbers of those who are being tested is very high and the numbers of those who are testing positive are very high. So the experts in Israel are pretty positive. There probably will be a bit of a raise because of the school year, because of the Jewish high holidays, but it does seem that the R number is going down, which is crucial, and the number of those getting ill and dying seems to be plateauing and even decreasing. So on the whole, it's relatively positive.
That's good to hear. All right. Well, we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. As a reminder, we will not be hosting a webinar this Friday due to the long holiday weekend. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a great day.